I, Dr. Rita Pratap, former head of the Department Drawing and Painting, University of Rajasthan, Jaipur. I am going to speak on the history of Chinese painting. Module 16, Northern Masters of the 11th Century. The second half of the Northern Song period from the mid-11th century into the early 12th century was an especially eventful age in Chinese painting. Ko Hisi 1020 to 1090 is a northerner from Hunan. Became an instructor in the Northern Song Imperial Paintings Academy and was noted for his large-scale screens and panoramas painted on the palace walls. Ko Hisi was also the author of a celebrated essay on landscape painting in which he had discussed the themes suitable for painting. He also gave technical advice for practical work and stressed that through art, the mind is cleaned, which is a traditional Confucian concept. Husu Tao Ning, Ye Wen Qiu and Cao Po Ming are also known as Northern Song academicians. Political disunity ended in 960 with the reunification of China under the first Shang Emperor. The new empire was smaller than that of the Tang, with the northeastern region of China remaining under the Liu control. The Liu would eventually be conquered by the Lin, whose invasion of China in 1126 forced the court to flee from its northern capital near the present-day Kaifeng and ushered in the southern period of Shang rule. In contrast to the cosmopolitanism of the Tang predecessors, Shang rulers turned away from the outside world to seek inspiration in traditional Chinese values as expressed in the arts and literature of antiquity. Great patrons of arts, the Shang emperors encouraged the collection and cataloguing of ancient bronzes, jades, and other artwork. Woodblock printing was used extensively to disseminate information about China's cultural heritage in handbooks and encyclopedias. The growing influence of Neo-Confucianism, a reformulation of earlier Confucian, Taoist and Buddhist ideas, brought with it a renewed reverence for nature that was to play a significant role in the evolution of landscape painting. To the Neo-Confucianism scholar, the moral principle or li was understood to be the essential congruence between every natural form and the supreme ultimate. By studying the natural world, men of cultivation hoped to gain a deeper understanding of what Taoists called simply the way. Thus, observing the landscape of the visible world and attempting to portray it in a painting were understood as valid paths to be followed in the ongoing quest for wisdom and spiritual growth. The second half of the Northern Song period from the mid-11th century into the early 12th century was an especially eventful age in Chinese painting. To understand all that had happened then, one would have to take into account the activities of many separate schools and individual masters, traditionals and innovators, academicians and amateurs working in a bewildering variety of styles. It was impossible to overemphasize the influence of the two groups of painters, Li Cheng, Ching Hao and Fan Quan on the one hand, Tung Yuan, Chu Jan on the other. Upon the subsequent history of Chinese painting, apart from the individualists and independents who appeared from time to time, almost every Chinese landscape painter up to modern times has considered himself to be a follower of one tradition or the other, or has consciously combined elements of both in an eclectic style. Fan Quan, 990 to 1030. Was the master landscape painter of the early Northern Song dynasty, lived in the barren area in the mountains of Shaanxi province in northern China. Fan Quan is best known for his austere paintings of the landscape north of the Yellow River. His goal was to capture the life spirit, Qi Yun, of nature itself, rather than merely to portray its outer appearance. Travelers Amid Streams and Mountains by Fan Quan. Northern Song dynasty, it is a hanging scroll, ink and color on silk, and at present in the National Palace Museum, Taipei. The artist's firm, deliberately brushwork with his signature raindrop texture strokes uniformly used on the boulders and cliffs displays a concentrated energy that makes the mountain appear to come alive. In this simplified composition, the distant cliffs usually depicted in monumental landscape painting were eliminated. This is the only surviving work painted by Fan Quan's own hand. As said by Mi Fu, the 11th century painter, in Fan Quan's landscapes, you can even hear the water. In the 11th century, the northern tradition of Li Cheng and Fan Quan was brilliantly developed by Pu Hisi, 1220 to 1090. A northerner from Hunan who became an instructor in the Northern Song Imperial Paintings Academy and was noted for his large-scale screens and panoramas painted on the palace walls. Pu Hisi was also the author of a celebrated essay on landscape painting, in which he had discussed the themes suitable for painting. He also gave technical advice for practical work and stressed that through art, the mind is clean, which is a traditional Confucian concept. On his advice on landscape painting, he insists again and again on the necessity amounting to an ethical obligation for the artist to study nature in every respect, to mark the procession of seasons, the way the same scene may look at morning and evening, to note and express the particular unique character of every changing moment, to select with care, to impart movement to water and cloud, for he says, water courses are arteries of mountains, grass and trees its hair, mist and haze its complexion. Indeed, as the painter knows the very mountains to be alive, so must he transmit that life, Qi, into the mountains that he paints. He too followed the monumental tradition of Li Cheng. Among the surviving works attributed to him, or rather his original works, is the Great Early Spring, dated to 1072. It is a hanging scroll and at present in the collection of Palace Museum, Taichung. It is the only extant Chinese landscape that rivals the Fan Quan and rather more complex than those of Fan Quan. He uses an exaggerating twisting mountain form, large wavering brushstrokes, shadows and spatial ambiguities to depict a mysterious and turbulent world. The design of this large picture, in contrast with the static, centralized Fan Quan compositions, is complex and restless. The sweeping S curve of the central column of rocks being balanced and supported by a subtle interplay of lesser masses. The outline is still important. Brilliant use is made of dark accents and of the sharp arresting silhouettes of rocks and trees against the mist, while the painter's mastery of depth, both visual and atmospheric, opens up new dimensions of seeing and feeling. Paintings in grandeur. Hu Hasi has brought to perfection the technique of atmospheric perspective, a method of creating the illusion of space and distance by depicting objects in progressively lighter ink tone as they recede into depth, suggesting the intervention of atmosphere between them and the viewer. Again, in contrast to Fan Quan, who, as it were, chops out the shapes of his rocks with short, stubby texture strokes. Hu Hsi models his form in soft, transparent washes of graded ink, accentuating their mass with arbitrary but dramatically effective highlights and shadows. This painting is a triumphant vindication of Hu Hsi's ideal. That is, landscape painting should have the power to arouse in the viewer the same kind of feeling that he would have if he is to wander in a real landscape. This deliberate play upon the emotions of the viewer, which Hu Hsi himself kept rigorously under control, was later exploited for its own sake by some of his followers, who mistook brilliance of effect for depth of feeling. Hints of it are to be found even in the so accomplished a painter as the Southern Song academician He Xiaokui. It became more obvious still in the work of the Ming painter of the Qi school, whom Tung Chi Chang naturally placed in his northern school. Autumn in the River Valley. It is a section of a hand scroll, ink and light colors on silk, and at present in the Freer Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C. This painting agrees best with his painting Early Spring as a production of the same hand. The points of similarity are numerous, even though the hand scroll is much smaller and quieter in mood. It answers the requirements set forth in Hu Hsi's treatise, inviting the viewer to share in imagination the feelings of the strolling scholar who moves leisurely through the landscape. Since this is intended as a painting one can move around in. Winter landscape is also a creation of Hu Hsi. This is also a hand scroll dated to 11th century and at present in the Museum of Art, Toledo, Ohio. Thus, Poughkeepsie was not only an influential member of the Imperial Painting Academy, but also the dominating figure among the northern painters of the 11th century. Pictures by him are attributed to several other important 11th century masters in this tradition have survived, among whom are Husu Tao Ning, 970 to 1052. He began life as a farmist and only later became a professional painter of large-scale panoramas. Was often commissioned to paint wall and screen landscapes for the houses of the rich. He produced superb hand scroll, adapting the towering mountains subject to the horizontal format in level distance pictures. One of the most dramatic, finest and original surviving landscape hand scrolls of the northern period is Fishing in a Mountain Stream. This is also a hand scroll with ink and slight color on silk, belongs to China, Northern Song Dynasty, and at present in the Nelson Atkinson Museum of Art, Kansas City, Missouri. Here in the painting, he uses sweeping washes of wet ink with minimum of outlining to form his tall, bleak mountains and broad valleys. The deep recession into space and the central mountain that extends beyond the edge of the painting help to create an effect of monumentality in the painting. Continuing the tradition of Li Chang, its drama lies in the saturated ink brush used to render the bare, spiky trees. Yan Wen Hui, 967 to 1044. He started his career by selling his pictures in the streets. He was noticed and commissioned to paint landscape on temple walls and eventually rose to painter in attendance at the Northern Song Court and a member of the Imperial Painting Academy. Cao Po Ming. He was the friend of Yan Wen Hui. He was also known as the Northerner Song academician who executed frescoes on imperial order. All the wall decoration of these and other Song artists disappeared with the destruction of the buildings that housed them. But several of the scrolls have survived, including a short hand scroll attributed to Cao Po Ming. In the painting of Cao Po Ming, Streams and Hills Under Fresh Snow, painter's accuracy of observation and his choice of the horizontal hand scroll format for this picture make anyone who looks at it feel himself to be actually wandering along a river bank. A warmly dressed gentleman greeting his visitor and a solitary fisherman are the only signs of life in a bleak, silent landscape that perfectly evokes the mood of a North China winter. This is a fine example of the poetry and the realism of Northern Song landscape painting, though it is perhaps rather too advanced technically for the date it bears, that is 1035. His other painting, Clearing After Snow on the River, dated 1033, detailed from a hand scroll, ink and colors on silk, and at present in the collection of John M. Crawford, New York. Unrolling the scroll takes one onto an imaginary journey along the river, past cottages of retired scholars, fishermen in their boats, bamboo groves, and tall pines. The most poetic passage is near the end. A solitary fisherman trudging homewards along the shore crosses a clearing between groves of trees. Skillful use of atmospheric perspective surrounding the nearby trees with haze and dimming those more distant and a convincing recession along diagonally placed earth masses open a deep space behind him. In success with which this is accomplished, the painting seems advanced for its time and in other ways as well. The broad broken sweeps of dilute ink on the heavily eroded banks, for example, resemble the axe-cut system of texture strokes used by Beaton more than half-century later. Now, the southern tradition in the 11th century. During the 11th century, the poetic ideals of Wang Wei and the broad, relaxed southern brush style of Tong Yuan and Chu Jian came together in person of Mi Fu 1052 to 1109. He too, a northerner by birth, who held a variety of administrative posts at the northern Song. Mi Fu was not only a painter but also a scholar, an incisive critic, and a collector of ancient paintings. Being an eccentric, he stepped himself in the past, went about in the costume of Tang Dynasty, and often painted pictures in antique styles. Mi Fu is chiefly known as the reputed inventor of a loose-free manner of painting landscapes in the monochrome ink, in which the forms of mountains are defined not by the conventional brush line but by the graded washes reinforced along the contour by blobs of ink, that is, the neat dot laid on the flat brush. This style of brushwork was particularly effective in rendering the misty landscape of the southern coastal region of China. Because his technique dispensed with the brushstrokes, which was the very foundation of traditional painting, it was considered highly unorthodox, so much so, in fact, that the Emperor Hui Tuzong, who reigned from 1101 to 25, himself a painter of exquisite conventional picture, would have none of Mi Fu's work in the imperial collection. His painted Misty Landscape is a hanging scroll dated to 14th century and at present in the collection of Freer Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C. It is a painting whose style laid itself open to easy imitation. However, and it was handed down by later generations of painters who could never have seen an original work by Mi Fu himself. Mi Fu's son, Mi Yu Zhen, was the first to develop his father's style, and several landscapes attributed to him have survived. His hand scroll, Cloudy Mountains, dated to 1130 in the Cleveland Museum of Art, Ohio. This picture stands the crossroads between the broad monumental concepts of the Northern Song painter and the more lyrical and poetic masters of the Southern Song dynasty. Painters of bamboo. Mifu being a leading member of an eminent circle of literary men at the capital, said that landscape painting was not primarily a means of representing nature but a very way of expressing himself. In the landscape painting, Mifu and his friend did not reject nature altogether. However, unconventional their forms, the cloudy mountainous clouds of Miyujen vividly suggest the mysterious life of nature. The very chi, that is the life breath, or shen, the spirit of the painting that had been enshrined centuries before in the first principle of Hishio and in the writings of Hu Kai Chi. But the spirit now depicted was not only that of nature, but equally and as time went on, increasingly that of the painter himself. When these men sought a medium for pure, abstract self-expression, they turned to calligraphy. Mifu and his friend, the great poet Su Tung Po, were masters of this supremely different art. In the swift, spontaneous movement of the brush in the balance of incline and empty space on the page, in the content of the passage itself, they found a unique union of vitality, form, and meaning, the perfect expression of the energy, intelligence, and nobility of mind of the ideal Confucian gentleman, hardly less abstract than pure. Calligraphy was the art of bamboo painting. The scholar often persecuted for their intellectual independence saw in the pliant strength of the bamboo, which can be bent but not broken, a symbol of their own ideals and role in society. In bamboo painting, moreover, the range of ink tone, the subtle yet instinctive spacing, the springing vitality and infinite variety of brush line are those also of the calligrapher. Added to this is the painter's power to suggest the life and movement of the bamboo itself. Mifu and his friend, the great poet Su Tung Po, were masters of this supremely different art, hardly less abstract than pure calligraphy was the art of bamboo painting. The first great northern Song master of the bamboo painting in Chinese history was Wen Tung, dated 1019 to 1079. One of his finest early bamboo painting is the Hanging Scroll, Bamboo and Withered Tree, dated to 12th century, ink on paper and in the collection of Kyoto, Japan. And his other painting, Bamboo, a hanging scroll, ink on silk, and at present in the Nelson Palace Museum, Taiwan. In these bamboo paintings, the brush discipline is evident in the control of each leaf stalk and compositional mastery in the great S curve of the main stalk and the disposition of the almost moving sprays and stems that branch from it. Now the paintings under the chin Tartars. King Yun 1151 to 1202. He was the member of the Han Lin Academy of Scholars under the Jin Tatars, who had conquered and occupied North China in 1125. The descent of the Tatars was a disaster from which the Sung dynasty barely recovered. The capital was sacked and the countless art treasures accumulated by the emperor himself was carried off a prisoner to the remote northeast. The leading figure in the Northern Academy before the Tatar occupation was Li Tang, 1050 to 1130. He was a very important figure in the transition between Northern and Southern Sung styles. Li Tang did indeed survive the Tatar conquest of the Northern Sung Empire and became the major elder figure of the new academy sponsored by the Southern Sung emperors. The master of a powerful landscape style based on the tradition of Fan Quan and Hu Isi. From the invading Tatars, Li Tang fled to the south. Some remained behind to carry on his manner through the 12th and 13th century. The other northern painters include Wu Yuanji. His painting, The Red Cliff, is also a hand scroll dated 12th century and at present in the National Palace Museum, Taichung, Taiwan. The painters Yang Shi-Hsin and Li Shan are important in that they preserved the manner of Li Tang with little change until the day when under the Mongols the imperial court was once more established in the north.